So we're going to do an acrylic painting today of this handsome fella. I'm going to start off by toning the paper, partly so that we're not painting directly against the white of it, but also it'll create a barrier of acrylic paint, so that whatever warping our paper does, for one thing, it'll do it only here, and it will also give us an impermeable surface to paint on top of, so that our paint is not instantly soaking into the paper and drying up and that sort of thing. So yeah, spritz it a little bit. This little spritz bottle is great. You should always have one on hand if you're painting with fast drying media like acrylic paint or gouache. So now I'm going to take a combination of some primary kind of guys. And I'm looking to mix up a neutral blech kind of color. All right, if it gets too purple, we'll add a little more yellow to it. Right about there, maybe a little more white. All right, and like I said, the goal of this is just to give us a barrier to paint against, and to not have a surface that's pure white. So we're going to put that on very transparently. Again, all we're trying to do here is create a barrier to keep our second coat from soaking in completely and drying instantly and having the paper show through. But also to not have a pure white paper to judge our colors against. You can see even in the course of the palette, we're using a palette that measures at about a 50% gray. And one way we know that is if we squint at it, you can see that yellow ochre is about the same value as the brownish gray of the palette. And yellow ochre, surprisingly enough, is a halfway point between black and white. It is a 50% gray. Okay, so we've managed to tone everything. Clean out the brush quick, and I'm going to reach over for a hair dryer. Once that's thoroughly dry, we should have taken all the warp out of the paper. And I'm going to start by mixing up a couple more characters for our palette here. So on the palette, I've got titanium white, Hansa yellow opaque, which is a total lie. It is not remotely opaque, but we're trying not to use cadmium today. And cadmium, up until very recently, was about the only opaque yellow out there. Bismuth yellow is very opaque and is quite lovely, but rather expensive. So keeping it on the affordable side, we got titanium white, Hansa yellow opaque, yellow ochre, as we already said, works as a 50% gray value, and mixed with colors makes them not quite the color you started with. Alizarin Crimson, Ultramarine Blue, and some Phthalo Green. Phthalo Green is a character we want to be careful with. It's a brilliant, beautiful, useful color that will get all in your business and never leave. But we are going to start off with it, not by itself. We're taking it and we're taking about an equal share of Alizarin Crimson and gently swirling them together. And if our balance is right, we will have something very close to black, but it's a chromatic black. And because the Alizarin Crimson has a violety undertone, it's a very cool red with some blues in it, and the Phthalo Green is a very cool green with a fair hint of blue in it. The red and the green are going to want to act as complements, and the blue and the red are going to want to act as buddies and make purple, and as a result, you get a very useful black that will mix with other colors as if it's a combination of red, blue, and yellow, as opposed to just soot or carbon. So once we've got that guy mixed up, and we still got our muddy 50% gray over here, which I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit to. This will also help tell us how neutral we've managed to get our black. And that looks pretty neutral. So we would like to have some gray to mix from, and particularly a gray that we know is a combination of colors. It's a shortcut to getting a neutral tint to anything. And that's going to take us to our Ogre. So I'm going to start off by painting this entire composition from dark up to a mid-tone, but I don't want to go straight into black. I want to reserve a little room that we can get darker. So in that case, I'm going to take my 3 primaries using yellow ochre instead of the Hansa yellow, because yellow ochre is pretty opaque. And both of these guys are pretty transparent. And I'd like to have a little bit of tinting strength to work with here. But I am going to make a fairly warm dark. And we can see compared to black, we've still got quite a bit of room. But compared to the 50% gray of our palette, or what we've got mixed up here, it's we've still got quite a bit of room to go before this classifies as a mid-tone. All right, and I'm going to go in and start to just state some of these darkest recesses in his face. Now you can see how dark that looks immediately. And so just think of what it would look like and what panic we'd be in if the starting point had been black, or if our paper had been white. Now I've got my sketch over to the side, so I'm going on that. I'm using the value study to help things along here. That is basically qualifying as my reference today. So going on that, and try to get these shadow tones, these big network of shadows to kind of lead together, so that my goal is that once we've blocked these in, we can already see where the picture is going. I'm trying to paint with a mostly quiet brush right now, not very scrubby. We don't want to get transparent, and we don't want it so wet that it's watercolor-like. Make sure that we're actually leaving some paint behind. And we're looking for everything, at least in the ogre's part of the picture, that seems to be this value. If we overdo it, we can always paint over it, but I'd like to not have to backtrack and find it again if I've missed anything. So, and remembering that this hasn't gone all the way down to black, I'm not too worried about overstating it. edge here. Keep picking up fresh paint. Okay, and I'm going to go into some of the darks of his vest. Get some of this to block in and mask together. Paint lightly with the brush. We don't want to push through much. We just want to state color. Okay, don't treat your brush like it's a pencil. It's really just there to push globs around. You know what, I'll even paint. I've got these little strings hanging from his shirt. I'm just going to paint over those on the premise that we can put them in on top of everything later. All right, now I want his hat to be blue. So I'm just going to go ahead and mix into that dark that I already have to make a cooler version of it. I'm going to continue wherever there's things that I want in the same family, I'm going to just mix out from my initial color. Think of this as being like little caterpillars that we're making on our palette. So that we can already see what they're going to look like together in the context of the painting. And by mixing them out of each other where it makes sense, it'll help spearhead a color harmony as well. Now, a word about that. The reason we're using such a limited palette here is partly to aid in that building of a color harmony, that with only 6 colors on the palette, there are going to be some colors that the palette leans towards and some hues that are just out of our range that we can only approximate. But the benefit of that is that by having those approximations throughout, if you're someone who's just doesn't naturally think in color and in color schemes and harmony, the limitation of this will actually help things tie together as the painting builds. Okay, now on that one, I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of our 50% gray because I want to give some recesses to his clothing. I look for areas where these folds get kind of deep. And like I said, still looking at my value study. Figure if I've already made all these decisions once, why make them again? And with acrylic, you definitely want to keep things pliable and wet on the palette, because once we dry, we've basically just got a sheet of plastic. There's no reviving it. Put a slight mist on there. All right, so now, before I get too bogged down in his face, I'm going to get some of these other values figured out, so that I know the job that his face has to do within the value scale. So I'm going to mix out in the opposite direction a little bit for his vest, which I want a kind of dingy leather appearance too. Let's get a little more 50% gray in there. And even as thick as that paint looks, it's actually going down pretty transparently. Acrylic paint, the way acrylic paint is made, it doesn't have the same pigment density as oil paint or gouache as far as the opaque media go. The acrylic binder that holds it together, that it's made from, only holds so much pigment. And so when you combine that with non-toxic, less opaque paint pigments, it takes a lot of paint sometimes to build up any opacity. So I've got shadows in there, and now I'm just building up what I'm going to think about as being like the local color of his vest. It's going to be the natural mid-tone to what's going on. Like I said, once again, looking at the value study to see where I decided that would happen when I was drawing this. Because, let's face it, painting is hard enough. All right, so we've got something there. Let's put in a local for his shirt as it comes out of that shadow. And I think for fun, I'm going to give it a kind of greenish tint. It just seems like an ogre-y color. Very careful with that phthalo green. All right, but I have something that is, in fact, lighter than those grays that I'd put in, but certainly darker than white. So I've got plenty of room to build it up. The lighter you press with your brush, the more control you'll have. All right, and keep an eye on your brush. Paint's going to move around on it. There's no magic trick to it. You can look and say, realize where it's all gone if it's no longer at the tip. And most of it is going to be on the side of the brush. Scoop up a little more. Get these planes blocked in. I'm using a small flat brush here. In this case, at least at this part of the painting, I like blocking in with a flat because it naturally enables us to think in terms of planes. It's just the kind of mark it wants to make, but at the same time, it's flat this way and then it's pointy that way. So we can actually get the best of both worlds out of it. And just be gentle. The brush is going to have a certain amount of character to it already, and that's going to be hard to compete with for beauty. So just let the brush do its thing. There are marks that it wants to make. All right, then I'm going to go ahead and, for this forest that he's kind of leaning into, we're going to go ahead and take something pretty dark, but that we can build on top of. I'm not going to so much paint the landscape now as I want a value and kind of color identity that will stand in for it. Maybe a little cooler than that. All right, but something that I can still get darker than and get lighter than. keep blotting. All right, so we got something blocked in there. Put a little bit of haze as it kind of fades away from us too. Which will give us something opaque to paint with as well. I don't know, I figured ogres like their woods a little bit on the misty side. Something that would be in the Ogre handbook or something that their realtors would know. All right. I'm going to take a little more ultramarine, a little more white. And let's see if we can establish like the little mountain range that recedes back here, somewhere on the value scale. We're going to trust the brush to make the right marks. All right, so we got something there. Let's go ahead and start building up some ogre skin tone. I'll take that coming off the 50%. I'm just going to add some yellow ochre and some alizarin to it. And look for shadows in his face. Now his skin tone in the highlights is going to get pretty light. Let's make that a little bit rosier maybe. There we go. All right, and we're just going to keep, like we started off with those darks, we're going to keep letting his shadows kind of network through his face. There's a lot of white mixed in with this one, so it's not going to be nearly as hard to keep it opaque. All right, I'm just going to keep an eye out for anywhere that shadowy value seems to happen. like I said, just going on the decisions made in the value study at this point. Figuring that if I put the right amount of work in, I should be able to think about color and temperature and texture right now. Now let's backtrack to this. All right, what we started with as the dark, I'm going to put a little bit of that in here. Keep it from getting too cool. I'm just going to help us get out of there in the painting. All right, you want to keep these guys around just in case you need them later. But again, if they dry up on you or if you use them up, that's the other benefit of the limited palette, is nothing on here is going to be so hard to reproduce. All right, there's only about 6 things we could have used as ingredients in any color. And so if we have to mix them up again, we can figure it out. And I haven't gone into his ear yet because I would like it to have a sort of different feel than a lot of his face. I want it a bit warmer. And it's all pretty small information. So I want to get this whole value scale of his face in place so that I know that his ear can be a mini version of that. So let's go ahead and start to lighten this up. And decide how olive complected or pasty we want our ogre to be. I'm thinking of keeping him on the cool side. At least for the local value, right? So we're not really even thinking about this as being in the lights yet. This is just the color that he is, that the highlight will be acting upon. Now, in listening to your brush, and by that I mean both keeping it from getting too loud, making sure there's enough paint on it, but also paying attention to the kind of marks it makes. You know, every surface we do, we have the potential to, you know, just color things in or to paint with the dimensional aspect of that surface, right? Do we paint with the plane of his face or do we paint across the plane of his face? And does our brushwork go this way or does it build up contrary to how we're seeing that volume? And likewise, I also want to get a little feeling of falling light on his face. The idea that the lightest lights are going to be towards the top and that the further down we get, the more limited that value scale becomes. So we're going to extend that sort of caterpillar idea on the palette and find something in between this light that I'm using and those shadows that we started with. I'm not thinking too much about the color of his lips or anything like that right now. Just want to get like the volume and the overall value in place. Right? And as it builds up, take a look at, what you've already painted and see if the values in it still make sense. See if there's any edges you want to take care of right now while the paint is still a little wet. Without getting too crazy with it or too far ahead of yourself. All right, so that looks pretty handsome. Now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to add I'm going to warm it up a little bit, get a little more crimson and yellow going on in there. So we can get some kind of blood vessels up closer to the surface of his face. All right, and once that's been achieved, go ahead and let his nose get a little warmer. Push a little bit of it into his cheeks. It might be a little too yellowy. Let's get a little more alizarin in there. Push a little bit into his forehead, just for temper's sake. Might be a little more than I wanted. Let's go back in with that light. Push back a little. And while we've got that warm one going on, let's pink it up a tiny bit more and figure out what's going on with his bottom lip, which is kind of pointed up towards the sky. Just want to insinuate that it's there, even though his overbite kind of stretches it out a bit. There we go. That seems about right. Let's take that warm one that we have and start dappling it in for a local color on his ear. If we obliterate anything around it, let's not panic. You can always go back and repaint. And like I said, all these colors, we know how we got there. There's only so many possibilities. Right. Now, like I said, I was going to give him a blue hat. So let's go ahead and grab some ultramarine, mix it off to the side here. block some in. Push a little bit into that shadow. And remember, all these darks can still get darker. We never went as far as black. Just came close. All right, let's give a little spritz to the palette. And we'll get his teeth to come close to matching his shirt. That'd be nice. That actually seems a little light. Well, let's leave it at that. Go ahead and dab inside his mouth where I must have been thinking I'd leave room for his tongue, but we can always build that up. Push my edges around a little bit. And let a little light hit the inside of his mouth. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and figure something out with that sky. I don't want it too bright and peppy. It is an ogre kind of day. And I've got it pretty light in my value study. So I'm going to go ahead and block this in. I'm thinking when it get further along, it might be kind of nice to have like some little patches of blue sky poking through it. But for that to have an impact, I think we want some clouds. Might even lighten it up a little more as we come around to the front side of his face. Trying to keep paint towards the front of the brush so we can just lay it on and keep moving. I want to worry about these edges now while I have the most paint and the paint is at its most pliable. It hasn't started to set up on me or anything like that yet, because that's going to be when it's easiest to push around and make do what I want it to do. All right, I don't want to scrub or fight to get it off the brush when I'm working on these edges. I just want some nice, reasonable globs that I can steer around. Right? Get as much paint on the brush and paper as you can, so you can just kind of steer blobs around rather than scratching and scrubbing to get it off your brush. Right? Because the brush and the paint don't care what your picture is. And as a result, they don't really respond well to being coerced. They're just going to do their own thing, and your job is to show them where to do it so that we can all get what we want out of the deal. Okay, and once we're through here, that'll be our first coat. We will have handled just about everything from shadow up to mid-tone. All right, we have just enough of our value range established that everything we do from here on we can weigh the impact of on both the color harmony and the value scale of the image. Okay, so there he is. We've let that first coat dry a little bit, and I'm starting to go in with some deep, really warm tones into some of these shadows in his face. Right, things that I decided we could go a little deeper with, but I want them to stay really warm when we do. Using a little watercolor brush for that, and fairly thin paint. Right, we can decide how specific we want some of these edges to be while doing that. And how deeply we want some of these spaces to recede. Now the thing is, if your values are right, if you get your values right, you can hide colors in lots of places. They can get as vibrant as you want, as long as they're serving the overall value of the picture, of the image that you're making. All right, so if our pure alizarin is the tone of the shadow that it's standing in for, it should play well with others right there. In that case, I'm now going to go ahead, build up another level of pink to put on that ear and build up its volumes a little more. And as we go further into our highlights, we want our paint to stay opaque, and we want the body of the paint to make a statement as well as the tone of it. So don't try to push too far with your brush. Just reload frequently. And be careful about getting your nose too close. You kind of need to in some cases, right, to negotiate these little things. But at the same time, you don't want to lose sight of what the effect is in your whole picture. Okay, so from there, let's go ahead and start looking at where the light is really hitting his face. We'll get it nice and pink with a little touch of yellow, just to keep it warm. And we're definitely, right, in the light end of the spectrum here, but still, you know, a bit of room before we get all the way to white. Okay, and we can make some statements. Like I said, keep refreshing that brush. Now be careful as these lights get transparent with a dark under them. If you're not careful and you're not intentional about where they do that, the paint is going to get cool whenever we can see through it. And that can lead to a kind of surprising muddying effect if you don't know that that's what's happening. The color is going to get just a little bit cooler as you get transparent with it or translucent with it. So just be mindful of that. So you want to make sure that the anatomy here is just right. So again, I'm looking at my value state and I realize like I spent quite a bit of time figuring out how the corner of his mouth and this kind of grimace line, what they communicate about the jut of his chin. All right, and since it does what I wanted it to in the value study, I want to make sure that it stays that way in the painting. Let the light hit this kind of active jaw muscle. And and make a statement. Right, both anatomically but also as a design element. Let's get some light on that bottom jaw. Now in this case, I'm not too worried about the cooling action of this peach color as it gets transparent here, but that's because it's on his chin. And it tends to be a kind of slightly cooler place on the face, and particularly on those producing masculine hormones of beard growth and such. He's allowed to get a little gray there. That said, no one said that your brushwork had to blend, right? Opaque hatch lines are a perfectly acceptable stylization to get in and out of gradations. This just comes down to personal aesthetic. All right, and even as much as this is building up, we haven't gotten to his nose yet, but as much as this is building up, we want to remember we still haven't gotten all the way up to white. We've still got room within our value scale if we need it. Have some fun with the planes of light on his nose. Lighten that up and let it get a little shinier. Pick up a little more light and some of these, along some of these major plane, important plane changes, or just places where people's faces get a little shiny. But again, especially in a situation like this is where you really want to back up, because a couple of these will really give him impact, and too many of them will flatten him right out. A little bit more of a crescendo of light on here. Now we can poke a few more over on his ear. And maybe get the edges of his ogre teeth to glisten a little bit. Right, but again, we want to be careful if we've got too many highlights of the same intensity in too many places, they're just going to make the whole thing flatten out. Right? We need them to stay a little bit special. Now the other thing that I'd reserved the opportunity to do within the value study is to give us some reflected light of a different color family. So I'm going to take some of that crazy Phthalo Green and some white, mix up a nice kind of minty highlight from that. And this is what I'm going to let be the reflected light coming from the other direction. So we can illuminate some backwards facing planes. And like I said, I'm improvising with the color a little bit here. But what's going on was already stated in the value study. So I'm continually referring there to make sure I don't get excited and overdo it. Little improvisation is okay, but we still want to make sure that if we've already solved the problem, we don't go making ourselves unnecessary trouble. And what's nice about that, and the reason I'm jumping to that right now, is because some of these other planes, it works only as a little accent on him, but there are going to be areas in his garments that are lit, or not so much lit, but the dimension we get of them is going to come primarily from reflected light from back here. So one main place is going to be that foreshortened plane of his leather vest. So, and like I said, we can always push back if we need to. So while I was letting the painting dry, I kept spritzing my palette just in case we had to backtrack. And as fast as acrylic is famous for drying, that little atomizer, that little spray bottle, makes a big difference. All right, let's go ahead and pick up some on his shirt as well. Some direct light, that is. In this case, I might switch back to that small flat that we were using before. So I don't get too bogged down in the details. And still give it just that little hint of a kind of yellowish green. All right, and trying to use my value study to sort of tell me where I thought this would happen. This is a case where it starts to, he goes down behind these trees. We can use this little bit of kind of peekaboo light to focus them a little bit more. All right, and let the more opaque planes of paint in this brushwork do their job up here. And then the same over here. Like with that sky, have enough paint that you can just push into that border, but not have to scrub to get it off your brush. All right, and let these planes make a statement. And kind of get in and get out. A little bit on this side of the collar here. And wherever possible, look for networks of these things. You would think that like a little highlight hanging out by itself would do something, but sometimes they need a greater purpose. They need to be, part of something or to lead to something. Get some highlights on our highlights here. Remember from looking at the palette, we could tell that we still had quite a ways to go before we worried about anything getting light or getting too close to white. Let's just take the back of the brush. I'm going to scratch a line back in here and then push back against it. Just so I keep the insinuation of an edge there. Okay, now I can always come back to that. I mostly wanted to make sure that I was happy with that edge. Maybe dry brush a little bit to get out of there. All right, let's go ahead and get a little more volume on his hat. Let's pick up some of these edges. I'll show what happens when it turns out of the shadow. again, just using the value study. There's no sense in trying to make all this up if I've already gone through the trouble of making it up. Here, the value study, if done right, is it's born from lots of reference and sketching and resketching and thumbnailing and thought to composition and light and more reference. The amount that goes into getting it right at that point should be there to serve the painting. It should be the halfway point to a finished picture. All right, let's see if there's anywhere that a little highlight of that makes sense. And we can actually put a little of the Phthalo Green into that highlight just to give it a little pop. When you add a lot of white to that Phthalo Green, it actually does look more like a blue than a green. And so we'll just use it to give a little bit of a kind of shimmer and temperature shift to the blue of his hat. All right. I'm going to revisit some of these lights using that warm tone from his shirt, actually, and see what happens if we recast it into the sky. Just tickling that edge slightly and making sure we've got enough paint that we don't have to scrub to get it on there. And don't be afraid to reuse colors as you go. What they look like is so often determined by what's next to them, not what they look like on your brush. And but in doing so, they can aid your overall color harmony within a painting. That as much as you may not consciously recognize this as the color of his shirt once it's in the sky, it's familiar enough to help tie the picture together. Let's see if we can get a little more white in there as we get down towards that horizon, I think. Again, when it comes to these edges, just keep refreshing your brush. like I said, there was a part where I was thinking it'd be fun to have just a little bit of blue sky poking through. So I'm going to take some of that Phthalo Green and Ultramarine Blue and just see what happens. Get a little more ultramarine in it. There we go. Just a little bit of blue sky peeking through. All right, now you can always paint a painting forever, right? There's always something. What I'm going to do here, though, in the interest of pretending this is finished, we're just going to take our darkest dark and add a little more alizarin to it. Remember that we have not gotten all the way to black at any point in this picture. I'm just going to pick a couple recesses and really push things back. Right. And I'm using it actually fairly transparently here. I don't want big impastos of dark. But by treating the dark as a warm, having it get a little transparent, in the same way that a light will get cooler as it gets transparent over a dark over a light will get warmer. And so I'm just looking for some edges and maybe even think about them as lines. That helps. Just some recesses that could use an accent. Maybe let's go a little more red in there into it. We'll just see if what happens if we put a little bit more depth in the opening of his mouth. And maybe a tiny dab near the nostril. It turns out there really was something that this painting needed from the very start, back before even the value study, early on in the conceptual phase, and that's really the ogre needed someone to yell at, and it's just become apparent after a while that what this painting really needed was a cliff with a pig standing on it.